Today we will talk about international trade. More specifically, we will talk about why countries trade, who trades with whom, and who should trade with whom. What does economic theory have to say about that? So description and prescription. So first, let's take a look at some statistics. Trades most. Which countries are most integrated in international trade? Obviously, the larger the country, the more they sell and buy. So it makes sense to measure international trade intensity as a ratio of imports-exports to GDP of the country. So basically, how much trade accounts in the total GDP or relates to the total GDP of the country. So when you look at the map here, you will notice that European countries, some Asian countries, trade actually a lot. So for many of them, GDP per capita is almost as large, or international trade is almost as large as their GDP per capita. My students are surprised when they see this chart that the United States is actually at the bottom of the list. It looks like the United States trades the least. Now let's try to explain that. Why for the United States international trade is so not unimportant, but so small compared to America's GDP. Several reasons for that. Well, first, some of these smaller countries, like the European countries, for example, or some small countries in Asia, like, for example, Singapore. Let's talk about Europe first. So in Europe, a lot of small countries are close to one another. And so you ship a product to a client just an hour away, and it crosses the border. You ship it 2 hours away, and it can cross 2 borders. So that shipping or shipment is considered international trade. You do the same thing in the United States. In fact, you ship a product from New York to LA. It will take a week on the highway for the product in the truck to reach the destination, but it will still be considered domestic trade because it's still within the same country. So the movement of goods within the United States is as intensive as the movement of goods within the European Union. But because in the United States, the states are part of the country, so it's not considered international trade. Whereas in the European Union, even though the geographic area is smaller than the United States, but each of those states is considered an independent country, and so the trade is considered international. So the United States or American companies trade a lot, but because the country is so big and takes up almost all of the continent, or at least a good portion of the continent, much of that movement of the products is considered domestic. And then, of course, there are some countries for whom international trade is really extremely important. Like, for example, countries like Singapore. So Singapore is essentially a port country, and a lot of goods go through Singapore, going from Asia into the rest of the world, from the rest of the world into Asia, or even just simply transiting through that part of the world. So for countries like Singapore, for example, international trade, that's a huge portion of the economy. That's how they make money. So they specialize in international logistics. So the United States doesn't trade little, doesn't trade less than others. It's just a big country, and that's why it looks like it doesn't trade much. In the absolute volumes, let's take a look here. The United States is actually one of the major traders around the world. So for example, when you look at the imports here, you will see that the United States is the biggest importer in the world, almost as big as all of the European Union countries combined. And when you look at the exports, the United States is second only to China. Again, if you don't count the European Union as an entity. So the United States buys a lot, but the United States sells a lot, almost as much, or quite close to that. And then obviously when we talk about the exports, China is the largest exporter. And yes, if you look around, many products you have are probably made in China. But also, for example, Germany. Germany is a major trader. So Germany sells a lot of products and buys a lot of products. All those BMWs and Mercedes and Siemens and whatever else you have from Germany, they sell it all around the world, but they also buy a lot of stuff. And so other countries that import a lot, no surprises here. Japan, the United Kingdom, so large countries that consume a lot. India, the Netherlands, and then the countries that export a lot. Again, countries that make stuff, nothing unusual. You kind of look around, what kind of products you have. You probably have some Chinese products. You may have some German products, some Japanese products, maybe some American, maybe you don't even know about that. So let's take a look here at about what the United States imports and exports. So when I ask my students what America buys, most of the students would say apparel, because most of the t-shirts they buy or most of the shoes they buy, they seem to be made somewhere in Asia or Latin America. Students obviously know that there are a lot of products from China here, like electronics, things like that. But when I ask my students what do Americans sell, in many cases my students don't really know. So let's take a look here at what America sells and what America buys. So in terms of what America buys, first, electrical machinery and equipment, so computers, not only your personal computers and iPhones, but also all kinds of industrial computers. All kinds of machinery, including, again, computers, but like industrial computers. Vehicles. The United States buys a lot of vehicles, all those South Korean Hyundais, Japanese Toyotas, German BMWs, and so on. But the United States also buys a lot of natural resources, a lot of pharmaceuticals, mostly, or a lot of them coming from Canada, and things like that. You can look at the whole list here. Some of the organic chemicals and things like that. Interestingly, these are pretty much the same things that the United States also sells. So, for example, the United States sells a lot of minerals, primarily oil and gas. So the United States is the world's largest producer of oil and gas, and it sells it a lot. So sometimes it competes with the Saudi Arabia, depending on the period you look at. But the United States makes a lot of oil, a lot of natural gas, and sells much of that overseas. Machinery, including computers. So yes, most of your smartphones probably are imported from somewhere else. But the United States also makes and sells a lot of them. Again, Apple computers, for example, Apple iPhones, even though many of them would be assembled overseas, a huge portion of those components are also sold from the United States. Electrical machinery, industrial computers, cars, American Fords and GMs, or other American-made cars by, for example, Japanese or by German manufacturers. For example, my wife drives a BMW X3, and so BMW X3, that specific model, was designed in the United States and is made exclusively in the United States. And so if you have a BMW X3 specifically, or if you see it overseas outside the United States, it was actually made in the United States, even though it's a German car or German company. So all kinds of plastics, pharmaceuticals, gems, precious metals, organic chemicals, and things like that, the United States makes in the United States and sells internationally. So here is another illustration of imports, exports. And so as you can see here, they're quite similar. So the United States buys some computers and sells some computers. The United States buys some oil and sells some oil. The United States buys some pharmaceuticals and sells some pharmaceutical, and so on and so forth. Some of the reasons being that, well, there are all kinds of pharmaceuticals. Some we buy, some we sell. There are all kinds of cars. Again, some we buy, some we sell. Chemical compounds and things like that. But also, in some states, there is a lot of oil, so they export. Those states, like, for example, Alaska sells oil around the world. But then other states may not have oil, like, for example, Massachusetts. And so for them, maybe sometimes it would be cheaper to import oil from some other places around the world. And so that's why we would sell some oil and buy some oil at the same time. Now, who trades with whom? Let's take a look at this chart here. So it shows trade by the regions of the world. And so I guess that you can take a look at the numbers closer. But the lesson that I see here is that it tends to be within regions and within sort of the development level. It appears that rich countries tend to trade more with rich countries, and poor countries, so to speak, tend to trade more with poor countries. but usually within their region. So, for example, African countries trade a lot with other African countries and much less with the United States, for example, or Japan. The European Union and the United States trade a lot with one another, and then a lot of trade within the European Union. Lots of trade within Latin America. So no surprises here. Now, let's take a look at what promotes trade. And so let me ask you this question. What factors determine or promote trade between two nations? I will give you a hint so you better understand my question, but then I will ask you to come up with another 5 or 10 factors that you think contribute to international trade. For example, distance, right? So when countries are close to one another, logically, they probably trade more. And when countries are very far from one another, they trade less. Transportation cost is expensive. And so when we are close to one another, when it's Germany and Belgium, for example, easy to trade. When it's Germany and Australia, not so easy. So clearly, distance would matter. What would be other things, in your opinion, that promote or slow down trade? I'll even give you here a list of factors that you would consider, and you think about which of those do you think matter most. So this is a study by Pankaj Gamavat, who actually tested how much each of these factors matters. So for example, income level. Do rich countries trade more or do poor countries trade more? Physical distance. We talked about that just a minute ago. Size. Do larger countries trade more or less? We kind of talked about that too, right? So the United States being a large country, it kind of trades more within the country, and it doesn't have as much need to trade externally. But how about things like access to the ocean, common border, common language, common currency? How much those things do you think matter? So take a second here and think about which factors you think matter most. Now, let me reveal the answers here. So here are the results of the study. It's from 2001. The numbers may be a little bit different today, but the logic probably stays the same. So not surprisingly, countries that are richer trade more. So the richer the country, the more it tends to trade. The closer they are, the more they trade, and the far apart the more physical distance there is, the less they trade. Access to ocean matters a lot. So countries that are close to the ocean, they trade more. But among the most important factors are, probably not surprisingly, common border, 80% increase, common language, 200% increase, common trading bloc, like for example, the European nations are part of the European Union. So, or for example, NAFTA, or now it's called the United States, Canada, Mexico trade agreement. So countries within the bloc trade much more. But surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the strongest factor is actually the colonizer history. So, for example, when you look at Africa, countries that used to be colonies of the United Kingdom, they still trade a lot with the United Kingdom. So it's actually so much that it makes no economic sense. For example, now we have smartphones, but not long ago we used regular landlines, like dumb phones, like one of those, right? If you see it there. So many international calls from within Africa, from one country to another, were actually commuted through the United Kingdom. So you would call from Ghana to Nigeria, and the phone call would go, like literally the signal would go to London and then back to Africa to connect those two callers. So a lot of institutions, a lot of systems, a lot of logistics is still tied to the former colonizer. And so a lot of trade is happening between, for example, the United Kingdom and its former colonies in Africa, or France and its former colonies wherever they are in Africa or other parts of the world. Matters a lot. And common currency helps a lot. So countries that have common currency, they tend to trade much more. So now, what explains what countries trade and what they trade? So let's take a look at some of the theories of international trade. So who trades with whom and why? So here is a timeline of international trade theories. And so when you look back, you can see that they date all, like a long time back. You probably have heard about Adam Smith, a Scottish economist who sort of was the first, in fact, one of the so-called founding fathers of economics in general, but specifically international economics. But also a lot of other theories have been proposed in the past hundreds of years, including also specifically in the past 100 of years. And when you look at the timeline, you will probably also notice that the intensity is increasing over time. Before we get into the specific theories, if there is one important thing that I would like to impart into you through this lecture, is this idea proposed or expressed by Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize, or one of the Nobel Prize winners in economics. So he said that in the international trade context, countries are not like corporations. Countries are like people. This is very important. So too often, when we talk about international trade, we think about countries as companies. We think about countries as companies that compete for a consumer. If I buy a Samsung phone, Apple loses because they don't get me as a customer, Samsung does. And when I buy an iPhone, Samsung loses because I basically choose the company, choose the client. And so they are in fierce competition. And this is not the best way to look at international trade when you think about countries trading with one another. International trade has the word trade in it. And when you look at the definition of that word, it is an exchange. So that's very important. So we are not trying to sell our goods per se. We are trading goods from country to country. So you give me something, I give you something. China gives me a computer, I give China wheat or barley. Germany gives me a car, I give Germany a computer. So it's a mutually beneficial exchange, just like the exchange among the people, right? So you paint my house, I fix your car. You do my taxes, I teach you international business. So it is a mutually beneficial exchange. And that's important because, countries, there is no sort of consumer out there. I guess you can think about third countries as a potential consumer, but it is more about exchange than it is about competition, although the competition element is certainly there. But keep that in mind as we will be talking about these theories here. So the first theory is well, maybe before I actually tell you what this theory is called, let me give you a real-life example. And let me ask you how you would advise the king in this situation. And then we will talk about the theory that would be best suited to explain what's going on here. So imagine that there is a country called Exemplania. It's a big, rich, influential country with excellent technology, powerful fleet, and some colonies. Maybe think like England or France a few hundred years ago. And so the king of this country, Exemplania, hires you as a consultant, asking what the king should do in terms of international trade to maximize the wealth of his nation. Should the king trade or not trade with other countries? If the king should trade, what should they sell and what should they buy to become as rich as possible? So the king really wants to get rich, and so the king is seeking your advice how they can leverage their power to become as rich as possible. So what would be your advice basically to a king of England 500 years ago? How would you advise, or what would be your advice in terms of international trade, what the king should do to maximize his wealth? Now, when I ask this question of my students, most of them say, well, if you're so powerful, if you have a powerful navy, maybe you should trade with your colonies, but in a very tricky way. So try to sell them finished goods, but extract from them natural resources. So buy unprocessed, cheap goods and resources from your colonies, and then process them, make finished goods, and then sell them to your colonies. And so this way you keep all the profits. And so they don't really say that, but if you continue with that logic, it would also mean that, well, accumulate wealth. So keep the difference in some form of money, maybe gold, have like full, I don't know, basements or full barrels of gold, and so become rich that way and use that gold then to maybe buy some, I don't know, make your navy even stronger. If any of the colonies are trying to rebel and trying to maybe compete with you in the international arena, suppress them, make them only a resource exporter, and then you sell the finished good. Now, that sounds like a good idea, and that's what it's called, or what we call the mercantilism theory. That's a dominant view in international theory for literally hundreds of years. It's been thoroughly debunked. It's not the best way to maximize your wealth, even though for many hundreds of years, that was the idea, that was the philosophy, the science, the thought of how you make money through international trade. So that is not the right way to do it. This theory has a lot of limitations. One, it assumes that the world is a zero-sum game. So either when we trade, either I win and you lose, or you win and I lose. And that's not really the case. We both can win. We can enlarge the pie. When we trade, we both become better off. And I'll show you in a minute how that might look like in terms of the numbers. It also constrains the input, output, and consumption. So the problem here is if your colony is poor, there is only so much you can sell to them. If they don't have the money, yes, you can be making the best whatever you make. Ships and guns and clothing and wool and I don't know, whatever else, jewelry. But you cannot really sell much of it to Africa, for example, if Africa remains poor. So you cannot really get much money from them. So not a very wise idea. Today we know that it would be beneficial for you if they became richer, because then you can sell more to them. They can sell more to you what you need, and you can sell more to them what they need. And so that's how wealth is accumulated. So Adam Smith. And so let's talk about some other theories that kind of fix some of those bad ideas or old outdated ideas. So let me give you another example that is illustrating this situation. And so again, in this case, you are hired as a consultant to Finland. The Finnish prime minister hires you and asks for your advice in terms of what they should sell and what they should buy. And to keep it simple, imagine here with a two-country, two-product situation. So imagine that you have only Finland and Portugal, and only smartphones and wine. And so Finland, and so let's imagine that each country has a budget or sort of economy that is $100 worth or big. Now, there are some data that you need to see here. So Portugal can make excellent wine at about $1 per bottle. So they can produce good wine at about $1 per bottle. And they can make cell phones, but for them, cell phones, they don't have good technology. It's very expensive to make. And so they can make cell phones at about $30 a piece. Now, Finland can make only, can grow grapes only in greenhouses because it's a cold country. So for them, wine will cost $30 per bottle to make. But they have great technology when it comes to phones. And so they can make phones at $1 a piece. And so the Finnish prime minister asks you as a consultant, should they make cell phones and buy wine? Should they try to make both wine and cell phones? Should they try to make wine? What should they make? What should they sell? What would be your advice? Now, if you are like my students, you are sort of probably getting somewhere. You probably figure out that Finland seems to be better at making phones, and Portugal seems to be better at making wine. And if so, maybe it would be beneficial to both countries if they traded with one another, right? If Finland made phones and sold the surplus to Portugal, And if Portugal made wine, which it's better at, and sold the surplus to Finland, so this way they can become both richer. And if so, that would be what basically the absolute advantage theory of international trade postulates. It says, find the product at which you are the best and make that product. Sell it because you can make a lot of money on it, you make it better than others, and then use the profits to buy things from other countries that are better than you at that other product. So, for example, Adam Smith was actually the one who postulated these principles. And so he was talking at that time about France and Britain. And so he recognized that Britain has better climate for breeding sheep, and France at that time had better climate for growing grapes and making wine. And so he actually showed and explained that it would be beneficial to both nations if Britain focused on making wool and selling it to France, and France focused on making wine and selling surplus to Britain. So very simple theory. But remember, I told you a few minutes ago that countries are like people. And so every time you substitute countries for people or people for countries, all of these illustrations become more obvious. So for example, let me give you here an example of Tiger Woods and Mario the plumber. So imagine a situation where Tiger Woods is a famous golfer, and he has many jobs, but one of his jobs is advertising for Nike. And he's extremely popular, he's extremely good at golf, and so Nike pays him $10,000 per hour for his work as a advertiser for Nike. All those photos that he takes for Nike, they pay him $10,000 for every hour of that photo shooting. Now, or in this case, it's Mario the plumber. So he fixes toilets, right? And he can fix toilets very well. He charges $50 an hour. And so he can fix a toilet in 4 hours, right? So it doesn't matter in this case in how many hours. Let's say, for example, he can fix a toilet in 4 hours, but Tiger Woods, he doesn't know how to fix toilets. It will take him 10 hours. So Mario, being better plumber, can fix it in 4. Tiger Woods, being not a very good plumber, can fix it in 10 hours. And so one morning, Tiger Woods wakes up and finds his toilet clogged. So the question then is, should Tiger Woods try to fix the toilet himself, spend the whole day, 10 hours fixing it? Should Tiger Woods call Mario the plumber to fix the toilet, or something else? And so when you look at this situation, obviously, everybody would say, of course, Tiger Woods needs to hire Mario, because Mario is better at fixing toilets, Tiger Woods is better at playing golf, and so both of them will benefit. Mario will make some money at what he's best at, and Tiger Woods will make some money on what he's best at. Very simple. So that's the absolute advantage theory. So you do what you're best at. So that's where the profit is, right? So now let me ask you this question. The United States, if you are my student in the United States, what would be the areas in which the United States has the absolute advantage? What would be the areas of the economy or industries or products and services where the United States is unsurpassed leader in the world? What is the United States best at around the world? Think about that for a second. So here are some of the observations that I have made. So one, location, for example. There is only one Grand Canyon on this planet, and it's in the United States. There is only one Statue of Liberty, and it's in the United States. So if that's what you want to see, you'd have to come to the United States. So tourism probably will be one of the important industries in the United States. Language. So English has become the global language. In the United States, English is the official language. So obviously products that hinge or are based on English would be probably best produced in the United States. Maybe some other English-speaking countries like the United Kingdom. So obviously English as a second language classes, the United States is well positioned to offer those. But also maybe movies in English, maybe some, music in English. So the United States has an obvious advantage when it comes to language. Agriculture. The United States has a lot of arable land, a very good climate, lots of land without people so that you can use for farming, and then also the United States has a lot of capital to buy tractors, plows, combines, fertilizers, pesticides. Again, puts the United States in a situation where it's definitely better positioned than most countries to farm. There are some other countries like Canada, like Russia, Ukraine, that also have a viable, vibrant agricultural business, but the United States probably is even better in that respect. So Canada, for example, huge country, but you can farm only along the thin strip along the U.S. border. You move a little further north, it's too cold, right? In the United States, from Florida to California to Midwest, all of that area is pretty suitable for farming. Military, again, historically, the United States has been a leader in making military equipment, all those rocket missiles, right? Tanks, aircraft. And so the United States has the technology, has the experience, probably one of the areas where it has absolute advantage. Yes, other countries also make tanks and aircraft, but the United States probably is a little bit ahead of the competition in this game. Now, here is a question that is likely to appear on the exam if you're taking my course for credit. So let's see if you can answer this question. So the trade theory that postulates that nations should accumulate wealth, usually in the form of gold, by encouraging exports and discouraging imports, is called what? And so, yes, this is the theory that we call mercantilism. So an outdated theory by now, but ruled the world for a long time, so to speak. Good job. Now, let's talk about next real-life case and next theory. So let's go back to the situation where we have, again, Finland and Portugal, two countries, wine and cell phones, two products, $100 budget that each country has. But now the conditions have changed. This global warming is going on, and so Portugal becomes too hot and too dry to grow wine. And so now in Portugal, it costs $10 to make a bottle of wine. Now, Portugal has also improved its technology and can make smartphones, but now it costs them $20 per phone to make it, as opposed to $30 before. So Portugal can make wine at $10 a bottle and smartphones at $20 a bottle. Finland, again, benefits from the warming. So Finland's climate gets a little bit warmer, and now they can grow grapes in some of their southern regions. And so now they developed the technology, and they can make excellent wine for $5 a bottle. And they can still make smartphones for $1 a piece. So here you have a situation where Finland is better at both making wine and making smartphones. And so the Prime Minister of Finland hires you as a consultant and asks you what Finland should do. Should Finland trade with Portugal? Think about that for a second. When I ask this question of my students, that's where they get a little confused. Before, that was easy. Finland was better at smartphones, making smartphones. Portugal was better at making wine. Obviously, they should focus on their respective best products and sell surplus and trade. But should Finland trade when Finland can make all products better? That's where my students get a little confused. Some say, well, we think they still should buy some wine. But then I would ask, why would Finland buy wine from Portugal at $20 a bottle when they can make it at home in Finland at $5 a bottle? Why? Why would you do that? And so the answer here is yes, Finland still should trade. Finland still should make smartphones and buy wine, and here is why. So if I had to explain it in one word, it would be opportunity cost. So here is a table that shows you sort of mathematically why Finland would be better off by making cell phones, selling them to Portugal, and buying wine from Portugal. But the main idea is that Finland can make much more profit on smartphones. So for every smartphone they make and sell, they make so much more money that they can use that money to buy whatever wine they want. But when they start making wine, they basically waste resources, because wine in Finland, it's cheaper than in Portugal, but it's not as profitable as smartphones. And so for every bottle of wine, you could make 5 smartphones, and you can sell those for much more. So you can buy much more wine when you sell those smartphones than when you try to make wine yourself. And again, math, people are not usually good at math. So the table that you see is probably hard to wrap your head around. So let me show you, again, a real life example with Mario the plumber, and this time with Michael Jordan, another famous Nike face, advertiser for Nike. So same situation, you have 2 gentlemen here. So Jordan is a famous basketball player, and Nike is paying him $10,000 per hour to advertise for Nike. Mario is an excellent plumber, and he can charge $50 an hour for fixing toilets. Mario takes 4 hours to fix a toilet, but this time Jordan is different from Tiger Woods. Jordan is very smart. He can master any trade. Plus, growing up, he had an uncle who was a plumber, and so Jordan often accompanied him to those jobs, and so he learned how to fix toilets. And he is very good at everything, including fixing toilets. So Michael Jordan can fix a toilet in 1 hour, very quickly. And so here is the situation. Michael Jordan wakes up, finds his toilet clogged, and he has a dilemma. Should he hire Mario to fix the toilet, or should he fix the toilet himself? Think about that for a second. Now, again, this is where my students get a little more confused, and they think, well, obviously it feels like he should hire Mario. And then I, being the devil's advocate, I say, why would he hire Mario? Mario will take 4 hours and will charge him $50 an hour. So Jordan can do it much faster in 1 hour himself. So, but the answer is obvious, because once we substitute countries or people for countries, it's obvious. Opportunity cost. Why would Jordan fix toilets and save the $200 when he can spend that money advertising for Nike and make $10,000? Yeah, he can fix the toilet in 1 hour, but he would not be only saving $250 or $200 that he would need to pay to Mario. He would also be losing $9,800 that he's not earning now for not working, for Nike. And so obviously the opportunity cost is too high. You don't want to waste your opportunity on fixing toilets. Nothing wrong with fixing toilets, but if you can make much more money doing something else, do something else. And then use that money to buy the services. For example, hire Mario to fix your toilet. And that's what we call the comparative advantage theory. So it's very similar to the absolute advantage theory, but it says, no, it could be beneficial for you to buy even the products that you may be the best at. So the comparative advantage essentially says that you should focus on making the products that are most profitable for you and not lose other opportunities, not lose the opportunity to make money on those products, and then buy everything else. So even if you make everything better than others, it may still be advantageous to you to buy stuff from others. And likewise, even if you're a country that you don't make anything better than others, maybe you are inferior at everything. Like, for example, in that example, Portugal. Maybe Portugal is not best at making cell phones or wine, but it still may find markets, international markets for its products, because for Finland, it may be still advantageous to buy the product from Portugal, wine, because otherwise they will be wasting their resources and making a less profitable product, which for them is wine compared to smartphones. So now, this sounds very logical. So it sounds very simple. Mario the plumber, Michael Jordan, so obvious, or Tiger Woods, makes so perfect sense. Why is this theory not perfect? What are the limitations of this theory? Why we have advanced beyond this logic, and now why we keep coming with other theories? What the comparative advantage theory cannot explain. And that, by the way, many of these remarks or many of these limitations apply also to the absolute advantage theory. So here are the limitations. One, the theory assumes essentially perfect employment. So the theory assumes that every minute you spend on making smartphones, you are not wasting that minute on making less profitable wine. But countries are, diverse. And so some people may have jobs and some people may not have jobs. And so in Finland if, let's say, the population of the country is 100 people, if only 50 people make smartphones and there are no factories, no jobs for others to make smartphones, they might as well actually make wine, because otherwise they will be just sitting and doing nothing. So obviously employment rarely is perfect, full. So there are some people who perhaps may not be suitable or available or interested in making that profitable product, right? Transportation costs are not taken into account. Yeah, you may be better at making smartphones, but maybe transporting them is very expensive, or maybe that wine is very expensive to transform. It also assumes perfect market conditions. So it assumes that anything you want to sell, you can sell, and anything you want to buy, you can buy. And it's not always the case. So sometimes there may be some protectionist measures in place, such as import tariffs or quotas. And so sometimes maybe you want to sell 20 smartphones, but maybe the quota allows you to sell only 10. Or maybe once you add the tariffs, the price becomes much higher and it's not as attractive to the consumers in the other country than it was before. Maybe there is a war going on between the two countries and maybe they don't want to buy your products. Or maybe it's political, maybe for whatever reason they impose a ban on your products. So there will be there could be all kinds of restrictions of that kind, and so the theory just doesn't take that into account. So here is a question that is likely to appear on the exam. Let's see if you can answer it. So imagine a situation where China can grow rice at $600 a ton, while the cost in South Korea is $400 a ton. China can also produce microchips at $500 a unit, but it would cost only $100 a unit to make microchips in South Korea. So basically, South Korea can make both rice and computer chips better and cheaper than China. So in this two-country, two-market condition, should South Korea trade with China or not? And if so, what should it buy? What should it sell? Obviously, the answer to this question is based on the comparative advantage theory that South Korea would be better off making computer chips and selling the surplus and using the money to buy rice. This way, they will maximize their wealth, because if they try to grow rice, they will be wasting their resources and money on a less profitable product. So again, it's an extremely simplified product, and we can talk about whether or not you can even compare those products directly, but that's the logic. Right? Okay. Now, another theory is that explains international trade is factor proportions theory. Relatively simple, not unlike the absolute advantage theory or comparative advantage theory, but here it focuses not on the products, but on what it takes to make the product. So it says that there are different factors or endowments that countries have, so like factors of production. So things that you need to make a product, such as natural resources, human capital, money, technology. So all of those are factors. And so the theory says that you should focus on the products at which or for which you have the production factors. So for example, if your country has a lot of cheap labor, you should make products that are very labor intensive. And so because you have a lot of cheap labor, it will be advantageous for you, will be more profitable for you to make those products. If, for example, you have a lot of natural resources, you might want to look at or start making products or selling products that require a lot of natural resources. Again, you have an advantage in that area. You have the production factors, and so you can be better off. You will make more money if you make that product. Nothing unusual, very similar to the comparative advantage theory, with the only difference here it being that it actually explains why some countries are better at some products. So we did talk before that, for example, maybe France had better climate for grapes and the United Kingdom had better climate for sheep ranching or farming. So same thing here. So climate could be a production factor, natural resources, educated personnel, cheap labor. So all of those could be. So it basically explains why some countries are better at some products than others. And then obviously the prescription is you should focus on the products for which you have good production factors. Now, there are some limitations of this theory. Again, it doesn't take into account regional differences. For example, in the United States, maybe Idaho has perfect climate and soil for growing potatoes, but Massachusetts doesn't. And so maybe some parts of the country should be growing potatoes, while other parts of the country should be maybe focusing on R&D or pharmaceuticals or something like that. And so obviously within the country, it could be mixed. So it doesn't mean that all of the United States should all of a sudden start growing potatoes. Same thing, that factors of production are not always mobile. So again, yes, the United States may have a lot of oil, but it may be far in Texas or in Alaska. And so for Massachusetts, maybe it would be cheaper and closer to buy oil from Norway, for example. So it may be closer, just less transportation, by the sea. So again, it doesn't take those things into account. The theory also assumes that everybody has the same technology, which may not be the case. Yes, Russia may have better climate, for example, for agriculture, but may not have the technology. And then vice versa, France or Italy or, I don't know, the United States, maybe the climate may not be as suitable for some crops, but with the right technology, the country can actually make it better, things like that. India, for example, has a lot of talented labor force, but they don't have the technology to make computer chips, whereas Taiwan does have the technology. And so Taiwan makes a good portion of the world's production of computer chips, right? And so same thing as with the previous two theories, the factor production theory assumes perfect conditions. It assumes that if you have oil and you want to sell oil, others will buy it. Maybe they won't. So for example, now Russia has oil, Russia has gas, it might want to sell it. But because of the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine that Russia is waging, so many countries say, no, Russia is an aggressor. We don't want to buy Russian energy. So Ukraine said no to Russian oil and gas a long time ago. The European Union banned it in 2022. So now Russia may be willing to sell the oil, but nobody wants to buy it. So sometimes that's also a condition, a factor, but it's not taken into account by this theory. Here is a question that, let's see if you can answer it. So the comparative advantage theory states that nation A can benefit by buying products from nation B, even if nation A can make both products better or can make that product more efficient. What would be the best keyword to describe the reason why the seemingly counterintuitive notion still applies? Why country A should or sometimes may be willing and interested, and it may be advantageous for the country to buy the product from another country, even if that country A can make the product better. What would be the answer? And the answer clearly is C, opportunity cost, right? So opportunity cost is the correct answer. Another interesting theory is called international product life cycle. So it explains pretty well why some products would be bought and sold at different times by different countries. I will use here computers as an example. And so you probably, if you're old enough, you may even remember how the shipments of computers from one country to another have been changing over time. So in the 80s, the United States was a leader at making computers. IBM, and then a little later Apple, and then others, Hewlett-Packard and others came along. And so the United States made computers in the US and sold them internationally. And so at that time, American computers probably were the best in the world. Not probably, definitely were the best in the world. And so it was a new product. So in the cycle of the product life, it was a new product. And so it was a new product. Nobody could make it well. The United States was the only country making good computers. And so obviously the United States made them in the United States and sold them internationally. But then in the 90s, computers became what we call a maturing product. So it became a little bit more developed, a little bit more standardized, a little bit less mysterious. And so other countries started learning how to make computers. Germany with Siemens, some Japanese manufacturers, some companies in Taiwan started learning how to make computers. And so at this time, computers were still made in the United States, but also were made in other countries. And so multiple countries were now good at making computers and selling them to countries They didn't learn how to make computers yet. Then, by the 2000s, the computer became what we call a standardized product, almost a commodity. Easy to make, any country can assemble them. You just slap a factory there and people will be assembling them all day long with minimal training. Yeah, I mean, maybe a few months of training. And so that was at that time, for the United States, it became no longer interesting to make computers because personal computers were, easy to make. A lot of countries, pretty much every country could make computers, or at least most of the countries. Ukraine was assembling computers, China was assembling computers, Thailand was assembling computers. So the profits were no longer in computer assembly because it's essentially commodity, very small profit margins. And so that was the time when you would see that computers would be made in Asia, primarily low labor cost countries, and not in the United States. So that was the time when Dell, when Apple started moving their own production facilities to Asia and make their computers, assemble the computers in Asia, and then re-export them back to the United States or import them into the United States, actually. And so sell them in the United States. So it makes sense. So here is another chart that illustrates how this looks. So here you can see that when the product was new, when the country is an innovator and the product is new, the country makes the product and sells it. But then over time, and other industrialized countries, basically the rest of the world buys them. But then as the product matures, so the leader and then becomes a standardized product, the innovator's country stops making it and buys it because now it's easy to make. And then less developed countries that only now learned how to make computers but have cheap labor, so they start making them. And so the less developed countries would first import computers, for example, but then over time they become more increasingly manufacturers of computers. So now, what would be the limitations of this theory? Again, it seems to make perfect sense when you think about it, but it's not a perfect theory. So what are the limitations of this theory? So here are some examples of the limitations. Well, one, it applies best to pre-industrial era or pre-globalization era physical products. So especially after the World War II, when Europe was destroyed and most innovation originated in the United States, most products kind of followed that cycle. So the United States would innovate, make the product, sell the product, the rest of the world would buy it, and then over time other countries slowly adopt it, and then the cycle sort of reverses. But it doesn't explain very well, for example, trade in services, and doesn't necessarily explain trade well today for other products as well. Another thing is it does not explain well, for example, some products like luxury goods. For example, Swiss watches. Well, mine is South Korean, but Swiss watches, for example. China can probably make watches that are equally good as the Swiss watches, show time equally well, equally accurately, right? But people want a Swiss watch, so they specifically want a watch from Switzerland. And it's not about innovation anymore. Yes, Switzerland used to be an innovator hundreds of years ago in that business, but now it's just more about prestige. It's more about the sort of luxury goods. Like, for example, if you want to buy some clothing, you probably would buy it, or, like luxury clothing, you probably would buy some Italian or French brands, things like that. Makeup probably would be from France, things like that. So the international product life cycle theory would not explain that very well. All right, here is a question for you. Let's see if you can answer it. So the examples with the clogged toilet, Tiger Woods, Mario the plumber, and Michael Jordan. So they were used to illustrate which of the following theories? If you've been listening to me, you obviously know the answer, and the answer would be absolute and comparative advantage theories. So good job, guys. All right, finally, the national competitive advantage theory, also known as Porter's diamond. So Michael Porter, probably the most famous, definitely the highest paid consultant over the last several decades, a professor at Harvard. So he developed this theory, I guess, or typology or model. So basically it says that nations' ability to sell products internationally depend on nations' ability to innovate. And his theory essentially explains what is needed to be an innovator, what is needed to be good at making some products better than others. And then by extension, if you're good at something, if your products are better than products from other countries, you can then sell your product. And then you can capitalize on all those other theories or notions that we described earlier. And so his model has 4 factors, 4 conditions that are necessary for the country to innovate and then make products that other countries want. And so we'll talk about them one by one. So there are 4 factor conditions, demand conditions, related supporting industries, and firm strategy and rivalry. So we'll talk about them one by one. So let's take a look at them. So first, let's take a look at the factor conditions. This is very similar to what we discussed a few minutes ago, the factor proportions theory. So basically, you need to have, according to Michael Porter's classification, basic factors for some products at least, such as geography, climate, natural resources, labor force, and maybe some advanced factors, such as maybe technology, such as a skilled labor force and things like that. I will use here Italian tile industry as an example. So Italy is a world leader in making tile, like, the ceramic tile that you put in your kitchen or bathroom. And so Italy is very, very good at making tile. And so one of the reasons being that it does have the factor conditions. So it has the climate, it has the natural resources, the clay, and then all kinds of minerals that are used for glazes. Historically have always had. In fact, they always had more materials to make clay tile than to make wood, for example, furnishings. And then they also have had the tile industry for a long time. They have a long history, apprenticeship programs, industries for literally centuries, if not millennia. And so over time, they developed considerable expertise in this product, in this industry. And so Italy has the factor conditions to make tile. And so Italy is good at it, and Italy sells tile all around the world. Also, Italy lost most of its, in the Second World War, it lost several major cities. They were completely bombed. And so there was also a lot of sort of production of tile needed and going on at that time, which led to also even more development of that industry that later on sustained that growth and expertise, being an innovator in that industry. So factor conditions, a few notes here on factor conditions that need to be taken into account. So one, they can change. Just because you have the climate today, you may not have it tomorrow. So for example, the United Kingdom now is becoming a major player in the wine industry. So yes, it used to be that wine would be easier to make in France, but now France is becoming a little too dry and a little too hot, whereas the United Kingdom is becoming more suitable for growing grapes. And so if you want, for example, like real, authentic, some of the wines, like Burgundy wine, for example. So 200 years ago, Burgundy wine was the best in France. But if you want to get the authentic, best Burgundy wine today, the climate the UK, Wales, actually part of the UK, has today is what France had 200 years ago. So the grapes that used to be made or grown to make the best Burgundy wine 200 years ago in France now can be grown in the United Kingdom and not in France. Same thing China. I still remember the time when China was considered a low labor, kind of low skill country. It's no longer the case. China now innovates like crazy. It has a huge population of very highly educated people. It publishes a lot of research papers. It does a lot of basic research, fundamental research, lots of innovation. So advanced factors for China have been developing rapidly over the last decades, and China now has more of them than they used to have before. Now, another factor is the demand conditions. So you must have demand in your country in order to be an innovator, to become an innovator. So going back to the Italian tile and the Second World War that I just mentioned. So when Italy was bombed and a lot of buildings were demolished, that created a lot of demand for construction materials, including tile. And so that allowed the tile industry in Italy to revitalize itself and become strong and developed so that they can first service the local domestic consumers. But then they became so good at it that they became also competitive globally. Same thing, for example, the software industry. So why is the United States so good at software? All those Google and Microsoft and Apple. So that first and foremost are software companies. So the reason for that again, and why others are not. The reason for that could be one, that Americans created more demand software than other countries. And one of the reasons could be maybe strong copyright laws. So I still remember the time when we used CDs. So I have an example here. Remember these things? So we had the CDs here. And so when you buy a software in those days, you would buy them on a CD. Like, for example, when you buy, I don't know, Windows software or Office or whatever else, you would buy a CD. And so in some countries, like, for example, in Russia, Ukraine, Asia, China, you could buy counterfeited copies. I remember I was for the first time in China, like in 2003, I believe, or 4. And you go to one of the markets there and you can buy, like for $1, a DVD with Windows on it, when the actual price at that time was something like $200 when you buy it legally, a licensed copy. And, on that DVD, you would have like 5 different languages, and you can buy even like several different software on one disc. In the United States, you could go to prison for that. In fact, I remember when I was studying in Dallas in 2001, 2002, there was a story there, must have been end of 2001. A guy literally went to prison and was fined a lot because the FBI, I believe, or maybe the local police, found, I think it was the FBI, found some some pirated music on his laptop. So a student from a university in Texas went to prison for having pirated music on his computer. Again, in China at that time, in Ukraine at that time, it would have been laughable. I mean, nobody would go to prison for violating the copyright laws. In fact, I don't even think the countries had copyright laws at that time. And so the companies that were writing code were, software companies in the United States. They were in a much better position because Americans had the money to pay for the product. And the competition couldn't just copy your product and then rip it off and just basically pirate it. So the copyright protection laws were very strong. And so companies were able to enjoy that demand, and so were able to sell enough of their copies because pirated copies were no competition and people had the money to buy it. And so that was the time when the United States saw the rise of Apple, of Microsoft, and then later on Google, Oracle, and some other companies like that. Next factor. So the so-called related and supporting industries. Most of the products, the truth is, require a whole network of companies to make. Like, for example, a smartphone here, or maybe your car, or whatever product you look at. The mouse here. So this one is made by Dell. This one is made by Samsung. But Samsung didn't make the whole phone. So they bought a lot of components from other companies. And so you need to have this whole industry cluster, production cluster as they call it, to make a product. And so here is a map that you can see that shows different production clusters in the United States. For example, if you want to make movies, right, you probably want to be in Hollywood because that's where you will find the studios, the actors, the scriptwriters, the video editors, the stuntmen, and whatever else is used to make movies. So if you decided to make a movie in Nebraska, you wouldn't have all that infrastructure. It would be very, very difficult to make a movie there. But if you go to Hollywood, all of the supporting industries are there. You need an actor, you post a note about audition, you'll have 10,000 people by the end of the day knocking on your door willing to audition for you. You need some video editing. Again, you post a note, you'll have a lot of companies doing that for you right there. So you need that cluster. Then obviously in Detroit, you have the automotive cluster. In North Carolina and in Massachusetts, you have R&D clusters and so on and so forth, right? Lots of those clusters. So if you want to make some of those things, you probably want to be in that cluster. Here is another example of how important supporting industries are. For example, do you know which country exports most diamonds? So which country sells most diamonds internationally and makes most money on diamonds? Again, when I ask this question of my students, many of them think like maybe Congo, maybe Russia, because they have a lot of diamond rocks in their soil. But the answer is Israel. So Israel is the biggest exporter of diamonds. Israel doesn't have diamonds in its soil, So it buys the kind of raw material. But to sell diamonds, you must have technical knowledge, market knowledge, access to distribution networks, branding, things like that. And so Israel is very good at that. And so even though it doesn't have the basic factors, such as the mineral itself, so it does have all those other advanced factors. And so that makes it much better suited to sell this product and make money on it. And so it does sell more diamonds than all those other countries that actually have diamonds in their soil. Next one is the firm strategy and rivalry. So basically competition. So you can have a viable industry, you can develop a viable industry only if you have competition within your country. So for example, the ceramic tile industry. So it does have very strong competition within the country. So historically, again, for centuries, the entry barriers were always cheap. So lots of clay around, lots of minerals around to make glazes. So anyone who has basically a bucket just goes, gets the clay, burns it, whatever the process, and makes tile. And then also that competition forced them to become better and better and better. And so over time, they developed the expertise, they developed the technology and became very good at it. So Germany is good at making cars. And so I remember a few years ago, like 5 years ago, so I snapped a photo of this newspaper. So here, Mercedes-Benz is thanking BMW for 100 years of competition. So it says there in German, Danke für 100 Jahre Wettbewerb. So basically, thank you for 100 years of competition. And so, yes, in a way, they are a problem for one another. Mercedes-Benz and BMW sell the same type of vehicle, and so they compete head to head. But at the same time, that competition makes them better. And so if there was no BMW or Audi or Porsche in Germany, then Mercedes probably wouldn't be as good as it is now because it wouldn't need to innovate as much. And so, yes, it's sort of a problem in the moment, but long term, it's actually a good thing. And so Michael Porter says that if you want to develop an industry, you need to set it up in a way that there is competition. And by the way, that's exactly what South Korea did. So I'm not going to get into many details of how South Korea developed its technical capabilities, but they did have programs specifically to develop, like, for example, automotive industry, in electronics industries. And they specifically wanted to have competition. So that's why they had, for example, like Hyundai and Kia. And they had also a couple, like I think Dell was another big major player, where they would have Samsung and they would have LG. I think at that time it was called Gold Star in the beginning. So they would have deliberately strong multiple players so that there is a competition and the companies have an incentive to innovate. So if I asked you what would be the prediction for the United States, in which area, in which industry does the United States have all of those factors? What would be your answer? You can pause here and think about, your own predictions. So here is my sort of take on it. So it seems to me that the United States may be very uniquely, well suited or positioned to become a leader in making electric vehicles. So obviously this time China does a better job in this industry, and Germans are pulling, Germans, Koreans, Japanese are getting kind of close. But the United States seems to have all of those conditions. So factory conditions, gas is no longer as expensive as it used to be. But then, for example, in California, gas is very expensive. So there is demand for other alternative types of transportation, including, like, for example, electric vehicles. The United States definitely has the qualified labor force. So the United States has a viable, vibrant automotive industry. So lots of people who know how to design cars. Demand conditions are definitely there. So the United States is a nation of car drivers. Americans love cars. So Americans buy a lot of cars. It's still the biggest market for cars. And so the United States and Americans do have money, so they can pay more, higher prices for now still more expensive electric vehicles. The United States does have all the supporting industries, like it has the Silicon Valley to write the code, because electric cars are kind of more software than hardware in some ways. And so, but also all the other supporting industries right there. And competition, it's definitely there. So we have Tesla, the leader in electric vehicle production at this time, but Rivian is also doing pretty well. Then General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler started making electric vehicles, and then all kinds of international competition too. So we have South Koreans, Japanese, Germans here, so they all compete. And so obviously that competition is right here as well. So now here is a question for you. Let's see if you can answer it. So the charts above relate to which of the following theories? Again, if you're listening, switch on the camera, take a look at the chart. And again, if you've been listening carefully, then yes, the answer to you is clear and obvious, and that's the International Product Life Cycle Theory. Very good job. Okay, so here is one more question. Let's see if you can answer this one. National Competitive Advantage Theory, Porter's Diamond, the one that we just covered, makes international trade predictions based on 4 factors. Which of the following 5 factors is not part of Porter's Diamond? Let's see if you can figure out which one is not one of the 4. And the correct answer is E, product development stage. So that's something that I just made up. It's not part of that theory. Finally, I would like to talk a little bit about, theories, economic theories. That's all very good. But let me tell you a little bit about why it's sometimes difficult to talk about international trade. Why sometimes it's difficult to talk about, who makes what and who sells what. Sometimes those discussions make very little sense. For example, not long ago, I was talking to a colleague who is an economics professor. He had a radio that broke down in his car, CD player actually at that time. So it was an older car and he had a CD player. And so he needed to replace it. And so he had a Hyundai, South Korean made Hyundai. And so he got this new CD player, the dealer installed it. And so he just wanted to trace where the CD player came from. And so here he had the situation where the car was South Korean, made partially in the United States. The CD player was designed in South Korea partially, but also partially in Japan. So the components were made in China, South Korea, and the US. The initial assembly of that CD player took place in Taiwan, and then the assembly was finished in Mexico. And then it was installed in the car, the new one at least, would be installed in the car in Mexico, where the cars are assembled actually. And so the question is, when we ask, who makes those CD players? What would you put? What would you put on the made in label? So I don't know. That's a difficult question because it really has components from all around the world. Or for example, if I ask you which of the 2 cars you see on the slide, Toyota Camry and Ford Mustang, which of the 2 is more American? When I ask that question my students, obviously they say Ford Mustang is more American than Toyota Camry. But is it really? Is it really? So if you look at those cars, at least at the time when Ford Mustang was still making Mustangs, today I guess it's an electric SUV. But about 5-7 years ago, they were still making Ford Mustangs, the race cars or the sports cars. And so when you look at the percentage of the parts, percentage of the added value added in the United States, actually Toyota Camry had more in it made in the United States than Ford Mustang. So that was very strange because, many people don't realize that. But Toyota Camry actually had more components in it made in the United States than Ford Mustang did. So, obviously both of them would import a lot of parts from all around the world. And both of them were assembled in the United States. But Toyota Camry is or at least it used to be the best-selling American car. And so it had a lot of American components in it, interestingly more than Ford Mustang does. So you never know until you actually look at what's kind of under the hood, so to speak. All right. Here is a picture of where the components come from that make up the Boeing Dreamliner 787. So technically, it's assembled in Seattle, in Washington State. But as you can see, the United States makes only some of the components of the aircraft. Many of them, in fact, most of them come from somewhere else. And so, yes, it's an American aircraft, but it does have a lot of Canadian, Australian, Japanese, Korean, and all over European components here, right? So here is another interesting story. So up until recently, up until the 80s, the United States was one of the biggest exporters of mohair wool. So there is this goat called Angora goat, and it makes very soft and long wool. And so that wool is extremely valuable for making sort of high-end clothing. And so the United States was breeding those Angora goats and making that wool, or, basically, sharing that wool and selling the mohair fabric all around the world. And the reason for that was not because the United States had the best climate to breed those sheep or goats, not because the United States has the best expertise, but because during the First World War, and then between the two world wars, the United States was afraid that it may be invaded from the north. And so especially after the Second World War, when there was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there was a concern that the United States may need to take part in battles in far north. And so the United States Army needed warm uniforms for cold climates. And so at that time, so right after the Second World War still, and up until then, obviously, the natural mohair wool was the best material for making warm clothes for soldiers. And so, seeing that as a national security matter, the United States Congress appropriated subsidies to American farmers who were breeding those Angora goats. And for a long time, the United States was basically subsidizing the production of this product. But then over time, other materials were developed. And synthetic materials were actually better suitable. Like, for example, when you look at what people wear now when they climb Mount Everest, it's primarily synthetic stuff. So, but for a long time, the Congress kept subsidizing the industry because the congressmen from the regions where farmers were predominantly located, who grew those Angora goats, they were the voters. And so the Congress people, the legislators were afraid to discontinue subsidies because that would upset their voters, their constituencies. And so they were afraid to discontinue the subsidies. And even though the United States Army switched a long time ago to different materials for to make the uniforms for the clothing, for the soldiers, the Angora goats were still one of the major products in the United States. The United States still made more mohair than other countries, and the United States still sold it. And so those subsidies were not discontinued up until 1982, long after the product itself was no longer of interest to the United States. So we can talk about economics all day long, but here you can see how politics was actually the factor. And this is where we're going to stop. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully this was educational and insightful for you.